Did you know that Einstein's brain had more glia? Scientists studied a special part of his brain that they thought was the math area.
Can we get on with it, NeuroBetty? I must know who has slandered our good name.
Queen Neuron, sheesh, you're still in a bad mood? Have some serotonin, teeny. Well, Queen Neuron, nobody knows for sure, but famous psychologist William James quoted to his fellow brain users in 1906 that we are only half awake. We are making use of only a small part of our physical and mental resources.
I've heard about him. My user was a psychology major. But I thought Dr. James was referring to the potential of our minds.
I think so too. I believe he was talking more about the psyche than about the brain.
NeuroBetty, I agree that most brain users have room for improvement in their minds, but why slander us, the poor, hardworking brain cells?
Well, some scientists believe the rumor was perpetuated by the famous neurophysiologist Carl Lashley, who called some brain regions silent cortex. Then the famous neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield came along. He experimented in the brains of his patients while they were awake by electrically stimulating different regions. He found that some areas responded with a feeling of being touched, while other areas responded by moving a muscle, and other areas responded with a visual image, and so on. But then there were parts that didn't seem to do anything.
NeuroBetty, do they really think we have vacant space? It's more crowded than a Tokyo subway in there.
We are using every nanometer of space we have.
Nanometer? That's 1/1000th of a meter.
Well, right you are. There are about 100 billion neurons and 1 trillion glia. That's a lot of brain cells to fit in your brain case. The brain is a perfect example of making efficient use of space. Let me show the folks at home. I have a model of the brain here. It's pretty cheesy, but it's all I could afford on a scientist's salary.
Yeah, those scientists are lousy tippers. Present company excluded, of course.
Well, let's start with the basics. The cerebral cortex is this big squiggly mass here, which curves around like so. The cortex is the command center. It carries out the higher functions. The rest of the brain is dedicated to functions that don't require much user intervention, such as breathing, regulating the heart, and other survival functions, but also things like emotions. The cortex is very highly developed in humans. It has nearly outgrown the skull. That's why it's all squished like this. Say that this is the cortex. If you unfold the cortex, it would be this big.
How do you fit all that in your skull, NeuroBetty?
It feels cramped sometimes, but we put up with it with the brain users because they can do all these amazing things. But do they care about us? No, they insult us.
Well, I never believed that old story. I've seen it for myself. Look at the brain under high magnification. Oh, hang on. I have that picture that I took with the electron microscope. Pons, could we see it on the viewer?
Certainly, NeuroBetty. Make it so.
Ah, here we have a picture of the brain magnified about 10,000 times. The brain is chock full of cell bodies of the neurons and glia. They're dendrites and axons and glial processes. The black circles, the really dark ones, are the processes of specialized glia called oligodendrocytes.
Now there's a mouthful.
The oligodendrocytes wrap around axons like the insulation on an electrical wire. There's a lot of axons that wire up the brain. Take my word for it, these neurons and glia are jam-packed. There's almost no space between them.
We wouldn't be so crowded unless all of us were important.
Yes, you're all very important, and you all perform special tasks. Cells that cooperate with each other live together in their own neighborhood of the brain.
Show them our neighborhoods, NeuroBetty.
Sure. Well, these squiggles are simply folds in the cortex sheet. The creases are called sulci, and the hilly parts are called gyri.
Are all brains folded the same, NeuroBetty?
No, the folds can be quite different in some people, but the chief sensory areas are pretty much the same. But like a muscle, some areas get bigger with use. For example, the cortex of a trained violinist may have a larger area for finger sensations and movements. Let me show you the touch area, or somatosensory cortex. All the touch, pain, and temperature receptors end up here. Of course, it crosses over first, so this is the sensory area for the left side of the body.
Ooh, are you going to talk about right brain, left brain stuff?
We could do a whole show on that. I find it fascinating. The left side is where language is processed and is thought to be the linear, rational side. And the right brain is the intuitive, creative side. They say that left-handed people have more access to creativity because they make more use of the right side of their brains.
Well, of course you'd say that, NeuroBetty. Aren't you left-handed?
Yes, and I'm proud of being a lefty. You know, the studies show that there are a higher number of artists that are lefty, you know. Anyway, this sort of specialization of the hemispheres is another way the brain makes efficient use of space. But let's move on. I have so much more to show you. Here in front of the sensory area is the motor area. This commands the muscles to move. The vision command center is in the back of the brain, and hearing is here in the superior temporal gyrus, in the temporal lobe, of course. And smell is at the very base of the brain. So you see, the senses are mapped to very small areas of cortex, but there's lots left over. These leftover areas are probably the silent cortex that Lashley was talking about. But they're important for integrating the senses, storing memories, and many other functions.
Gee, NeuroBetty, where'd you learn all those names?
Well, I learned them a long time ago in graduate school, but then I use them so I don't forget them. You know the old saying, use it or lose it? I specialize in studying the connections between parts of the brain. They call it neuroanatomy. I also teach neuroanatomy to medical students, but they always forget. So many names, mostly in Latin or Greek. They even wanted the parts numbered. But where's the poetry in that? I love the crazy names of these brain parts. Ah, the hippocampus. That looks like a seahorse. The dentate gyrus, which looks like teeth.
NeuroBetty, you're getting off the subject.
Oh, sorry, Queen Neuron. Where was I? Oh, yes. I think the silent cortex may have been damaging evidence. You see, those neurons were done back in the day when we didn't know very much about how you work. Well, if you didn't speak up when the scientist poked you with his electrode, he couldn't see what your function was. Maybe you didn't do anything.
Well, NeuroBetty, that's completely unfair.